My twin sister agreed to be our surrogate. Months later, my husband left me for her, saying that the baby needed its biological mother. I didn't argue. I just waited for the day of the birth and turned their biggest dream into the biggest shock of their lives. It started 18 months ago in a sterile white room that smelled like antiseptic and failure. The doctor's words were a guillotine dropping on my future. Infertility was the sentence, and I was the only prisoner. Mark held my hand during the drive home, but his grip felt loose, like he was already letting go. We tried to maintain normalcy by hosting our weekly dinner with Elena the following Friday. The clinking of silverware against fine china sounded violent in the quiet dining room. I pushed grilled salmon around my plate, unable to swallow past the lump in my throat. Elena watched me with those matching green eyes, but hers held a strange, predatory glint I mistook for sympathy. She waited until the wine had been poured to drop her bomb. Elena reached across the mahogany table, covering my trembling hand with her warm one. She spoke about miracles and genetic bonds, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. She offered her womb like a sacrificial gift, promising to carry the burden I couldn't. I wept with gratitude, blinded by the sheer magnitude of her generosity. I didn't see the smirk she hid behind her napkin as Mark squeezed her shoulder. 3 weeks later, we sat in a high-rise office surrounded by leather, bound books and expensive advice. The attorney, a sharp man named Mr. Henderson, slid the thick contract across the polished desk. He tapped a specific paragraph with his pen, emphasizing the term gestational carrier only. He explained that biology and legality were two different beasts. Elena nodded enthusiastically, claiming she just wanted to be the cool aunt. She signed her name with a flourish, the ink sealing a fate she didn't understand. When it was Mark's turn, the air in the room shifted. He hovered the pen over the signature line, his eyes darting between my hopeful face and Elena's exposed neckline. For a split second, he looked like a man standing on a ledge, deciding whether to step back or jump. He cleared his throat, muttered something about the legal fees being high, and finally scratched his name. It wasn't a commitment to me, it was an admission of guilt I failed to recognize. I signed last, pressing the pen down so hard it nearly tore through the paper. I believed I was securing our legacy, ensuring a future where a piece of us lived on. We toasted with sparkling water and champagne, celebrating the beginning of our journey. I looked at my sister and husband, thinking we were a united front against the cruel hand of nature. We thought we had signed a contract for life, but I had actually signed a warrant for my own replacement. The digital stick displayed the word pregnant in bold letters. It should have been the happiest moment of my life, a culmination of science and sacrifice. I gasped, hands flying to my mouth, waiting for Mark to sweep me into his arms. Instead, he pivoted toward Elena. He lifted her off the bathroom tiles, spinning her around while she squealed. I stood near the sink, clutching a hand towel, watching my husband embrace my sister. I was a spectator in my own miracle. 2 weeks later, the dynamic solidified in the dimly lit ultrasound room. Dr. Evans applied the cold gel to Elena's stomach, humming a soft tune. There was only one chair next to the exam table, and Mark took it without hesitation. He held Elena's hand, staring rapturously at the grainy monitor. I was forced to stand by the door, clutching my purse like a stranger intruding on a private moment. The rhythmic whoosh of the heartbeat filled the room, sounding like a taunt. By the 3rd month, they developed a language I couldn't speak. I came home from work to find them in the kitchen, flour dusting the countertops. They were making pierogies, a recipe our grandmother hadn't made in years. Elena laughed at something Mark whispered, her head thrown back, exposing the long line of her throat. When I asked what was funny, they exchanged a look. "You had to be there," Mark said, wiping flour from Elena's cheek. I realized I wasn't there anymore. I tried to reclaim my ground by focusing on the nursery. I brought home swatches of soft yellow and gray, excited to discuss paint. Mark barely glanced at them. He was scrolling through his phone, showing Elena a listing for a sleek, modern crib. "We were thinking sage green," Elena said, emphasizing the we. "For my apartment. The baby will need a space there for visits." Visits. The word hung in the air. I didn't know how permanent those visits would become. The only time they needed me was when the invoices arrived. I sat at the kitchen island, writing checks for prenatal vitamins, specialist copays, and organic groceries Elena insisted were necessary. When I mentioned the mounting costs to Mark, he sighed loudly. "Don't stress her out." "Caroline," he snapped, grabbing a beer from the fridge. "Cortisol is bad for the baby." I was the villain for worrying about our bank account, while she was the saint for existing. My concern was framed as toxicity. The paranoia drove me to snoop one Tuesday, while Mark was in the shower. I checked his jacket pockets, fingers trembling as I pulled out a crumpled receipt from a jeweler. It wasn't for a rattle or a silver spoon. It was for a diamond pendant, inscribed with the date of conception. My stomach churned with bile. Husbands bought push presents for their wives, not their sisters-in-law. The receipt was dated 3 days ago, paid for with a credit card I didn't know existed. I put the receipt back, my hands shaking so hard I nearly dropped his coat. That evening, I watched them on the sofa. Elena rested her head on his shoulder, and his hand stroked her hair. It wasn't familial comfort, it was intimate possession. They looked like the parents, and I looked like the hired help. The cold truth settled over me. I was paying for the medical bills, but I was no longer paying for a seat at the table. The driveway was crowded when I pulled in at 6. My parents' beige sedan sat parked behind Mark's truck, blocking my path to the garage. It was a Tuesday, a night usually reserved for laundry and quiet dinners, not family gatherings. A heavy knot formed in my stomach as I unlocked the front door. The house was too quiet. No television, no cooking sounds, just a thick, suffocating silence. I walked into the living room and froze. They were waiting. They sat arranged on the gray sectional like a jury ready to deliver a verdict. Elena was in the center, her hands resting protectively over her 6-month bump. Mark sat close enough to touch her, his thigh pressed against hers. My parents flanked them, their expressions grave and pitying. I dropped my keys on the console table, the metallic clatter echoing loudly. "What is this?" I asked, though deep down, I already knew the answer. "We need to talk," Mark said. Mark stood up, but he didn't move toward me. He stayed within Elena's orbit, as if anchored by gravity. "This arrangement," he started, gesturing vaguely between us. "It's not natural, Caroline. We've been talking, and we realized we can't ignore the biology here." My breath caught in my throat. "Biology?" I repeated. "That is my egg, Mark. That is my child." He shook his head slowly, looking at me with a terrifying calmness. "Elena is the one carrying the life." He took a deep breath, preparing to deliver the line that would sever our marriage. "The baby needs its biological mother," he said, his voice steady. "The bond they share is physical. We can't break that." The room spun. He was rewriting science to justify his infidelity. Elena wiped a single, photogenic tear from her cheek. "I never meant for this to happen," she whispered, her voice trembling with rehearsed sorrow. "But I feel her kicking. She knows me." I turned to my parents, desperate for sanity. "You can't seriously support this," I pleaded. My mother refused to meet my eyes, focusing instead on the rug. "Caroline, you've always been so career-focused," she said softly. "Elena has always been the maternal one. We have to think about what is best for the grandchild." My father nodded in agreement. "It's a stable home, honey. They're a family." The betrayal was total. My own blood had chosen the incubator over the architect. "We think it would be best if you stayed elsewhere," Mark added, twisting the knife. "Just until the dust settles." The rage that had been boiling in my chest suddenly froze into something hard and sharp. I looked at the 4 people who claimed to love me. Screaming would only prove I was unstable. Fighting would make me the aggressor. I needed to be invisible. "Okay," I said, my voice void of emotion. I turned on my heel and walked toward the stairs. In the bedroom that used to be ours, I pulled a suitcase from the closet. I moved with mechanical precision, packing clothes, toiletries, and the folder of legal documents from the nightstand. I didn't cry. I didn't break anything. I zipped the bag shut and walked back down the stairs. They were still sitting there, relief washing over their faces as I headed for the door. They expected me to scream, to fight, to beg. Instead, I gave them exactly what they wanted: my absence. The office of Evelyn Vance smelled of mahogany and expensive intimidation. It was the kind of place where dreams went to die or be resurrected for a price. I placed the original surrogacy agreement on her glass desk, smoothing out the creases where I had gripped it too tightly. Evelyn adjusted her spectacles, her eyes scanning the dense legal text with predatory focus. She didn't offer tea or sympathy. She offered billing hours and results. I waited, heart pounding, fearing a hidden loophole. "This document is exceptionally clear," Evelyn finally said, tapping a clause on page 12. "It explicitly states that the gestational carrier waives all parental rights upon conception." She looked up, her expression severe. "Because the embryo was created using your genetic material, the law views your sister as a biological vault, not a parent." My shoulders dropped an inch. The betrayal felt heavy, but the law was weightless and absolute. They were playing house, but I held the deed. Evelyn leaned forward, interlacing her fingers to bridge the distance. "The fact that she is carrying the child is irrelevant to custody," she explained coolly. "She is providing a service. Think of it like a contractor building a house. They don't get to keep the keys just because they laid the bricks." The analogy was cold, clinical, and exactly what I needed to hear. Elena wasn't a mother. She was a medical babysitter who had decided to steal the baby she was paid to watch. I moved into a studio apartment smelling of stale coffee and previous tenants. It became my war room. My laptop screen glowed late into the night as I monitored their digital footprint. Elena had blocked me, but she forgot about my burner account. I watched her post a photo of my baby's ultrasound with the caption, "Our little miracle." Mark commented with heart emojis. They were publicly building a narrative of a happy, complete family, erasing my existence with every pixel. I didn't cry at the photos. I took screenshots. Every post, every comment, every declaration of their child went into a digital folder labeled evidence. I found photos of a baby shower my mother hosted, featuring a cake that read, "Welcome Baby Taylor." I wasn't invited, but my genetic material was the guest of honor. Evelyn had advised me to document everything. These weren't just family photos anymore. They were proof of a conspiracy to interfere with my custodial rights. A courier arrived on a rainy Thursday with a thick envelope from Mark. It contained divorce papers and a settlement offer that was insulting at best. He offered me the car and a small payout in exchange for a clean break and waiving any claims to the current family unit. He was trying to buy my child for the price of a used sedan. He clearly thought I was broken, destitute, and desperate enough to take the scraps he threw. I signed the papers immediately. I didn't contest the assets or the pathetic alimony. I wanted them to feel safe. I wanted their guard down. I mailed the envelope back the next morning with a calm note wishing them the best. Evelyn called it a strategic retreat. I called it bait. They thought they were building a new family on the foundation of my silence. They didn't realize they were actually building a prison of their own making. Riverside General smelled like floor wax and anxiety. I approached the admissions desk with the confidence of a woman who owned the building. My objective was simple: ensure the birth certificate paperwork reflected the law, not Mark's fantasy. The clerk, a young woman named Sarah, typed my name into the system. Her brow furrowed as she looked at the screen. "Mrs. Taylor, there seems to be a note here," she said, hesitating. "Mr. Taylor called yesterday to update the mother's information." The battle had started early. I didn't blink. I pulled the notarized court order from my bag and slid it across the counter. "Mr. Taylor is confused about the legal terminology," I said smoothly. "As you can see, the gestational carrier has no legal standing regarding the birth certificate." Sarah read the document, her eyes widening at the judicial seal. She typed rapidly, deleting Mark's unauthorized changes. "I've locked the file," she whispered, looking at me with newfound respect. "Only you can authorize changes now." Back in my studio, I packed a bag that no mother should have to pack. Instead of onesies and swaddles, I filled it with copies of the custody order, the surrogacy contract, and the contact info for private security. I felt like a soldier prepping for a raid rather than a parent expecting a child. My phone sat on the table, like a grenade waiting to explode. Every vibration made my heart hammer against my ribs. The silence in the room was deafening. Days bled into a gray smear of waiting. I barely slept. Terrified I'd miss the call. I imagined them at home, timing contractions, playing Happy Family one last time. My mother posted a status update. "Any day now." So excited to meet our girl. Our girl. The possessive pronoun made my blood boil. They were counting down to a celebration. I was counting down to an extraction. I paced the small floor until my feet ached, rehearsing my lines for the confrontation. The notification came at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. It wasn't from Mark or Elena. It was an automated alert from a shared email account Mark had forgotten to remove me from. A receipt for hospital parking at Riverside General. My breath hitched. They were there. The labor had started. I grabbed my coat and the heavy binder of evidence. The fear that had paralyzed me for months evaporated, replaced by a cold, crystalline focus. The time for hiding was officially over. I dialed Evelyn immediately. She answered on the second ring, her voice crisp and alert despite the hour. "It's happening," I said, striding to my car. "Meet me at the north entrance in 20 minutes. The security team is already en route," she confirmed. "Remember, Caroline, do not engage until we are present. Let the law do the work." I hung up and started the engine. The dashboard clock glowed neon green, marking the start of the end of their delusion. As I pulled onto the highway, my phone buzzed with a text from Mark. I glanced at the screen, expecting a generic update or perhaps a gloating announcement. Instead, the message read, "Please don't come. Let us have this moment. You can see the baby next week." He knew what they were doing was wrong. He wanted a moment, a stolen memory before reality crashed in. I gripped the steering wheel harder. He wanted a moment. I was about to give him a lifetime of consequences. Evelyn Vance stood by the security desk, flanked by two men in dark suits who radiated a hired authority that made the night guard sit up straighter. I smoothed my coat, clutching the evidence binder to my chest like a shield. Evelyn nodded once, a sharp movement. "We move quickly," she said. "The floor is secure." We marched toward the elevators, an invading army in business casual. The sterile air felt cold against my flushed skin. This wasn't a family visit. It was a hostile takeover of the life they stole. The station nurse reached for the phone as we approached. "Ma'am, Mr. Taylor left strict instructions that no guests are allowed," she stammered. Evelyn didn't break stride, slapping the emergency court order onto the counter. "Interfering with a custodial parent is a felony." Evelyn stated, her voice projecting enough volume to turn heads. The nurse looked at the judicial seal, then at me. Recognition dawned in her eyes. She slowly hung up the phone. Room 304, she whispered, stepping aside to let justice pass. The hallway stretched out like a tunnel, the fluorescent lights humming a low, headache-inducing note. I could hear the sounds of room 304 before I reached the door. The beeping of monitors and the strained, guttural groans of labor. My mother's voice drifted into the corridor. You are doing great, sweetie, almost there. It sounded like a memory from a life I used to have. My hand hovered over the handle. There was no going back after this. I took a jagged breath and pushed the heavy door open. The scene inside was a tableau of betrayal frozen in time. Elena lay on the bed, sweat plastering hair to her forehead, while Mark gripped her hand. My parents stood at the foot of the bed like proud sentinels. When they saw me, the room went silent, save for the heart monitor. Mark's face drained of color. Get her out of here, he snarled, pointing a shaking finger at me. She has no right to be here. He lunged forward, but my security detail stepped in, blocking his path. Chaos erupted just as Elena let out a primal scream. The doctor, ignoring the drama, shouted for her to push. The legal argument was drowned out by the biological reality of birth. I stood against the wall, a silent specter, watching my sister deliver my child. It happened fast. A final HIV, a wet gush, and then the sharp, piercing cry of a newborn. Mark was crying, reaching for the baby as the nurse cleaned her off. He looked at me with triumphant defiance, believing he had won. Give her to me. Elena sobbed, arms outstretched, waiting for her reward. The nurse wrapped the baby in a pink blanket and turned toward the bed. Evelyn stepped forward, her voice cutting through the emotion like a scalpel. Check the bracelet ID against the court order, she commanded. The nurse froze, looking from the weeping woman in the bed to the formidable lawyer. She checked the wristband on the infant. Then the document Evelyn held up. The legal guardian is Caroline Taylor, the nurse announced, her voice trembling. The scream that tore from Elena's throat wasn't from physical pain. That is my baby? She shrieked, trying to sit up before collapsing back against the pillows. I carried her. She's mine. Evelyn didn't flinch. You carried a genetic stranger, she replied calmly, citing the specific clause of the contract. You were compensated for a service, Miss Taylor. That service is now complete. My parents started shouting about cruelty and rights, but their voices sounded distant. All I saw was the nurse walking toward me, not them. Mark tried to shove past the security guard, his face twisted in ugly rage. You can't do this, Caroline. You can't just take her, he yelled, struggling against the guard's grip. I am the father. I looked him dead in the eye for the first time in months. And I am the mother, I said, my voice steady. The courts agree. Security will escort you out if you don't calm down. He stopped fighting, the realization hitting him. He had traded his legal wife for a fantasy that just evaporated. The nurse placed the bundle in my arms. The weight of her was grounding, a warm, solid reality in the middle of the madness. She smelled like vernix and lavender soap. I looked down at her face. My face, staring back at me from a tiny, crumpled copy. The bond Mark claimed existed between him and Elena was a lie. The biology in my arms was the truth. I pulled the blanket closer, shielding her from the room's toxicity. I had won, but it felt like a funeral. We're leaving, I announced, turning my back on the people who raised me. As I walked toward the door, the doctor cleared his throat. She has the strawberry mark, he noted quietly, pointing to the baby's shoulder. Just like the mother. I paused. Elena didn't have that mark. Only I did. It was nature's final signature on the contract. As I walked out of those double doors, the sound of my sister's heart, Breaking was drowned out by the sound of my daughter's first breath. The locks on my new apartment door were heavy. Expensive deadbolts that clicked with a satisfying finality. Inside, the nursery was a sanctuary of soft light and silence, far removed from the hospital chaos. My phone vibrated incessantly on the kitchen counter, a digital graveyard of pleading voicemails and angry texts. I didn't listen to them. Instead, I sat in the rocking chair, feeding my daughter, Maya. She was the only reality that mattered now. Outside, the world was burning down, but in here we were untouchable. It was the calm before the legal storm. 3 days later, we stood in family courtroom 4B, the air thick with tension and cheap cologne. Elena looked pale and hollow, leaning heavily on my mother for support. Her lawyer, a man who specialized in emotional theatrics, launched into a passionate speech about maternal bonds and psychological trauma. He argued that the 9 months of gestation created a de facto parenthood that superseded any contract. It was a compelling performance for a jury, but unfortunately for him, we were in front of a judge who cared only about statutes. Judge Morrison didn't even look up from his files when the lawyer finished. He adjusted his glasses and spoke with a dry, bored tone that signaled the end of Elena's fantasy. "The contract is valid and binding," he stated, flipping a page. "Miss Vance has no genetic link to the child and voluntarily waived all rights. Case dismissed." The gavel banged, a sharp wooden crack that shattered the silence. Elena slumped forward, weeping into her hands. There was no dramatic music, just the sound of a clerk stamping a file closed. In the hallway, my parents cornered me near the water fountain. My father looked aged, his bluster replaced by desperate confusion. "Caroline, be reasonable," he begged, reaching for my arm. "She's your sister. You can't just erase us." I stepped back, my heels clicking sharply on the linoleum. "You chose a side," I said, my voice devoid of warmth. "You bet on the incubator and lost the mother. Do not contact me again, or I will file for harassment." I walked away, leaving them standing in the fluorescent glare of their failure. Mark caught me at the elevator, his face a mask of righteous indignation. He held a piece of paper, waving it like a weapon. "I am the father," he hissed, blocking the doors from closing. "The judge confirmed my paternity. You can't keep me from my daughter." He thought this was his victory, his foothold back into my life. I smiled, a small, dangerous expression that made him pause. "I would never dream of keeping you from your obligations," I replied. "Evelyn has the paperwork ready for you." Evelyn stepped forward, handing him a thick envelope with a polite nod. "Since you insisted on establishing legal paternity, the state requires a formal support arrangement," she explained. Mark tore open the envelope, his eyes scanning the numbers. His jaw dropped. $1,800 a month. He choked out. "This is half my take-home pay." I pressed the button for the lobby. "That's the state guideline for your income bracket," I said. "Babies are expensive." "Mark, you said so yourself when you decided to start a new family." "But wait, there is more," I added as the elevator doors began to slide shut. "You are also liable for 50% of all prenatal and delivery costs, retroactive to the date of conception." His face went gray as he did the mental math on 40 weeks of specialist appointments and a private hospital delivery. He was looking at a debt that would cripple his credit score for a decade. He wasn't just losing his wife, he was losing his truck, his weekends, and his financial future. I heard through the grapevine that the romance died quickly under the weight of poverty. Mark was now living in a cramped apartment with Elena, who was deep in a depression and unable to work. They had no baby to bond over, only mounting bills and the ghost of the life they blew up. The natural connection he preached about couldn't survive the unnatural stress of litigation and debt. They were trapped together in a misery of their own design, staring at a crib that would remain empty forever. My mother tried to bypass the blockade a week later, showing up at my building with a casserole and a plea. The doorman, instructed by my security team, didn't even let her into the lobby. She left the food on the sidewalk, a pathetic offering to a god she had angered. I watched from my window, feeling a strange hollowness where the guilt used to be. They wanted access to the joy without apologizing for the pain. But access was a privilege, and they had revoked theirs months ago. The final blow came not from me, but from inside their own camp. Evelyn called me on a Tuesday with news that made me laugh out loud for the first time in a year. Elena had filed a lawsuit against Mark for intentional infliction of emotional distress and lost wages. She was blaming him for the failed scheme, cannibalizing their relationship to salvage a payout. They were turning on each other like starving wolves. I hung up the phone and looked at Maya, sleeping peacefully. The war was over. The swing set squeaked in rhythm with the cool autumn wind. 2 years had passed since the gavel fell, and the silence I once feared had become my greatest ally. Maya, now a toddler with wild curls and my stubborn chin, laughed as she chased a fallen leaf across the grass. We lived in a city where no one knew my maiden name or the sordid history of my divorce. The air here smelled crisp, free of the suffocating scent of betrayal. I watched her run, marveling at how light freedom actually felt. She tumbled onto the grass, scraping her knee on a hidden root. Tears welled up instantly, her little face crumpling in distress. "Mama!" she cried, reaching out with muddy hands. The word hit me with the force of a physical blow, but in the best way possible. It wasn't a title I had stolen or bought. It was earned through sleepless nights and legal battles. I scooped her up, kissing the scraped skin. She buried her face in my neck. She knew exactly who her mother was. News from back home arrived through the few mutual friends I hadn't cut off. Mark was working double shifts to meet the garnishment orders, living in a studio apartment that smelled of regret. Elena had moved back into our childhood bedroom, effectively erased from adulthood. They had tried to build a monument to their ego. But without the foundation of truth, it crumbled. I didn't feel pity for them. I felt the cool, detached satisfaction of a debt fully paid. They were ghosts haunting a house I no longer owned. For a long time, I believed that my silence during those months of pregnancy was a sign of weakness. I thought I was a coward for not screaming when they pushed me out of family photos. I was wrong. My silence wasn't surrender. It was the deep breath a sniper takes before the shot. It was the calculated patience of a predator waiting for the prey to expose its neck. I looked at my reflection in the pond water. The woman staring back wasn't broken. She was fortified. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the envelope that had arrived yesterday. The handwriting was Mark's, shaky and desperate, likely filled with apologies or requests to reduce payments. He probably wanted a second chance, or perhaps just a picture of the daughter he couldn't afford. I didn't need to know which. The paper felt heavy with his expectations, a final attempt to intrude on our peace. I pulled a lighter from my bag, the flame flickering orange against the gray sky. I held the corner of the envelope to the flame until the paper curled into black ash. It dropped to the gravel, carried away by the wind before it could touch the ground. Maya tugged at my hand, pulling me back toward the slide. "Coming, Mama?" she asked, her eyes bright and unburdened by the past. "I am coming," I replied, squeezing her hand. I didn't just survive the fire they set to my life. I used it to forge a new one that they could never touch again.